A cruel millionaire forced his new cleaner to attend a luxurious event to humiliate her. However, when she arrived, everyone was left speechless. Andrew Carter leaned back in his leather chair, the city skyline glittering through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office. His empire stretched as far as the eye could see, both figuratively and literally, from high-end real estate to luxury brands. Andrew Carter was a name synonymous with power and prestige. But anyone who worked for him knew there was another side to the man. Cold, calculating, and utterly unyielding. In his world, people were tools, and he made no effort to hide it. If you weren't useful, you were disposable. It didn't matter if you were the top executive or the janitor cleaning the hallways of the Carter estate. Respect was something Andrew demanded, never gave. This morning, as he walked through his sprawling mansion, the staff froze in place, their gazes fixed on the ground. Andrew's presence was a shadow they tried to avoid. His sharp features and tailored suit made him look every bit the untouchable billionaire he believed himself to be. "Mr. Carter," called Linda, his assistant, rushing to keep up with his long strides. "The charity gala is confirmed for this Friday. Invitations have been sent, and the press will be there." "Good," Andrew replied curtly, barely sparing her a glance. "Make sure it's perfect. No mistakes." "Yes, sir," Linda said, already mentally preparing for the long list of demands that perfect would entail. Downstairs in the servant quarters, Claire Bennett adjusted her cleaning cart. It was her first week at the Carter estate, and she was already learning the unspoken rules. Stay invisible, keep quiet, and never draw attention to yourself. Claire wasn't one to complain. She was used to hard work, having grown up in an orphanage where chores were part of survival. Her small frame and unassuming presence made it easy for her to blend into the background, which suited her just fine. As she dusted the library's ornate shelves, Claire caught sight of Andrew entering the room. She quickly averted her gaze, pretending to focus on her work. "You missed a spot," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. Claire froze for a moment before turning to him. "I'll fix it right away, sir." Andrew's eyes lingered on her for a second longer than usual. There was something about the way she carried herself, calm, composed, almost dignified, that irritated him. Most of the staff cowered in his presence, but Claire didn't. She wasn't defiant, but she also wasn't afraid. "See that you do," he said, dismissing her with a wave of his hand as he left. Claire let out a quiet breath. Encounters with Andrew were rare, but they always left a lingering tension in the air. In the days leading up to the gala, the mansion buzzed with activity. The staff worked tirelessly to prepare, transforming the already grand estate into a spectacle of elegance. Claire found herself assigned to tasks that kept her out of sight, which was exactly where she wanted to be, but Andrew had other plans. It was during a meeting with Linda that an idea struck him. His eyes scanned the list of employees, stopping on Claire Bennett's name. "Who's this?" he asked, tapping the paper. "Claire. She's new. A housekeeper," Linda replied, confused by his sudden interest. Andrew's lips curved into a small, calculating smile. "Perfect. Assign her as my assistant for the gala." Linda blinked. "Your assistant, sir. She's not trained for—" "Do as I say," Andrew interrupted. When Claire received the news, she was stunned. Assisting Andrew Carter at a high-profile gala wasn't just intimidating. It felt like a setup for failure. She tried to protest, but the head housekeeper shut her down. "It's not a request, Claire. Just do your best and don't embarrass him." Friday night arrived, and the Carter estate was bathed in golden light, with luxury cars lining the driveway. Guests in designer attire flowed into the grand ballroom, their laughter and conversation filling the air. Claire stood in the servant quarters, staring at herself in a small mirror. She had borrowed a modest dress from a friend, one that was simple but elegant. Her reflection surprised her. For the first time in years, she saw something more than a cleaning uniform and tired eyes. Taking a deep breath, she made her way upstairs, where Andrew waited by the entrance. He glanced at her, his usual expression of indifference barely shifting. "Stay close," he said curtly, "and don't speak unless spoken to." "Yes, sir," Claire replied, keeping her voice steady. As the evening unfolded, Claire moved through the crowd, quietly observing the world of excess and pretense that surrounded her. Andrew, meanwhile, played the perfect host, his charm masking the ruthless man underneath. But even as he smiled and exchanged pleasantries, his mind kept returning to the woman standing discreetly in the corner. There was something about Claire Bennett that he couldn't quite place, a quiet strength that both intrigued and unsettled him. For the first time in years, Andrew Carter found himself paying attention to someone he considered insignificant. The gala was in full swing, the ballroom alive with the clinking of champagne glasses and the murmur of polite conversation. Claire kept her head down as she trailed behind Andrew, her modest dress and soft-soled shoes making her blend in with the waitstaff more than the guests. Andrew, as always, moved through the room like a shark among fish. His presence was magnetic, commanding attention. Even among the elite, Claire followed him as he greeted CEOs, politicians, and celebrities with practiced ease. Her task limited to carrying a small notepad and pen for anything he might need. "You'll take notes on anything important," he had told her earlier, his tone dismissive, "but mostly stay out of the way." And she had, doing her best to remain invisible. But tonight, something felt different. Andrew's gaze would occasionally flicker to her, his sharp eyes studying her with an intensity that made her uneasy. "Andrew," said a woman in a shimmering gold gown as she approached, her smile bright and calculated. "I see you've brought an assistant tonight. How unlike you." Claire stiffened, sensing the mockery in the woman's tone. Andrew's lips curved into a small, cold smile. "I thought I'd try something different, Claire. This is Evelyn Porter, one of our most generous donors." Claire nodded politely. "It's a pleasure to meet you, ma'am." Evelyn raised an eyebrow, her gaze sweeping over Claire from head to toe. "Charming," she said with a hint of sarcasm before turning her attention back to Andrew. "I hope you're not going soft on us." "Not at all," Andrew replied smoothly. "Claire is here to ensure everything runs perfectly tonight. Isn't that right, Claire?" "Yes, sir," Claire said quietly, feeling the weight of both their gazes as Evelyn moved on. Claire's cheeks burned with humiliation. It was clear to her now. Andrew hadn't brought her to the gala to assist him. She was there as an object of curiosity, a tool to amuse and perhaps even embarrass him in front of his peers. The realization stung, but Claire forced herself to remain composed. She couldn't afford to lose this job, not after everything she'd endured to get here. The night dragged on, and Claire's role remained the same: follow, observe, and occasionally jot down a name or a detail Andrew deemed worth remembering. But with each passing hour, her discomfort grew. The glances from the other guests, the whispers behind hands. It was as if everyone could see through Andrew's charade. At one point, Andrew led Claire to a group of his business associates, men whose tailored suits and self-assured smiles mirrored his own. "This is Claire," Andrew said, gesturing toward her with a faint smirk. "She's new, but eager to learn." The men chuckled, their laughter grating against Claire's nerves. "She's got a lot to learn if she's working for you," one of them joked, eliciting another round of laughter. Claire forced a polite smile, her grip tightening on the notepad in her hand. She wanted to disappear, to vanish into the background like she always did. But tonight, there was no escaping the spotlight Andrew had placed her under. As the evening wore on, Claire's resolve began to waver. She could feel the weight of every whisper, every judgmental glance. And yet, through it all, she refused to let her composure slip. By the time the gala neared its end, Andrew had shifted his focus elsewhere. Engrossed in a conversation with a prominent investor, Claire stood near the edge of the room, her shoulders aching from hours of standing. She scanned the crowd, her gaze landing on the grand staircase leading up to the second floor. For a moment, the idea of slipping away crossed her mind. She could find a quiet corner, somewhere to breathe, to regroup. But just as she took a step toward the staircase, Andrew's voice cut through the noise. "Claire," he called, his tone sharp and commanding. She turned quickly, her pulse quickening as she made her way back to him. "You're not paid to wander," he said, his eyes narrowing. "I wasn't wandering," Claire replied, keeping her voice steady. "I was just—" "Save it," Andrew interrupted, waving her off. "Go wait by the entrance, the car will be here soon." Claire nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat as she walked away. By the time the guests began to leave, Claire was standing near the grand doors, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Andrew joined her a few minutes later, his expression unreadable. As they waited for the car, He glanced at her, his gaze lingering. "You handled yourself well tonight," he said, his tone almost begrudging. "Thank you, sir," Claire replied, unsure if it was a genuine compliment or another backhanded remark. Andrew didn't respond, his attention shifting as the car pulled up. But for a brief moment, Claire thought she saw something different in his eyes, something almost human. The ride back to the mansion was silent, the tension between them palpable. Claire stared out the window, her thoughts a whirlwind of frustration and confusion. She had survived the night, but the experience had left her with more questions than answers. What was Andrew's game, and why did she feel like a pawn in it? The morning after the gala, Claire awoke to the soft hum of activity in the servant quarters. Sunlight streamed through the small window above her bed, casting a warm glow on the neatly folded uniform on her chair, despite her exhaustion from the previous night. She had barely slept. Her mind had been restless, replaying every interaction, every cutting remark, and every judgmental glance she had endured. What bothered her most wasn't the humiliation. It was the lingering feeling that Andrew Carter had singled her out for a reason she couldn't yet grasp, as Claire prepared for her day. She resolved to let it go. She couldn't afford to dwell on Andrew's games. Her job was to stay under the radar, to blend into the background and survive another day in the Carter estate, in the grand dining room upstairs. Andrew sat at the head of the table, sipping his morning coffee while skimming the headlines on his tablet. The gala had been a success, as he had expected, and his guests had been suitably impressed, but his thoughts kept drifting to Claire. He had intended to humiliate her, to remind her of her place. Instead, she had held her ground, with a quiet dignity that unnerved him. It wasn't defiance. It was something deeper, something he couldn't quite put into words. "Sir," Linda's voice broke through his thoughts. She stood by the doorway, clipboard in hand. "What is it?" Andrew asked without looking up. "The board meeting is scheduled for this afternoon, and the Bennett girl has requested a shift change for tomorrow." "Something about a personal matter." Andrew raised an eyebrow. "Personal matter? Since when do the staff have personal matters?" "I can deny the request if you'd prefer," Linda offered. "No," Andrew said, setting down his tablet. "Approve it, but keep an eye on her." Linda hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Of course, sir." Meanwhile, in the servant quarters, Claire was preparing for her upcoming shift when the head housekeeper approached her. "Bennett," she said, her tone brisk, "Mr. Carter has asked for you personally again. He wants you to assist with preparations for the estate's anniversary gala next weekend." Claire froze. Another gala after the ordeal she had just endured. "Is there a problem?" the housekeeper asked, narrowing her eyes. "No, ma'am," Claire replied quickly. "I'll do it." As the week unfolded, Claire found herself thrust into the center of the preparations. She was tasked with coordinating deliveries, ensuring the ballroom was clean to perfection, and managing the arrangement of decorations. It was grueling work, but Claire took it in stride, her focus unwavering. Andrew, however, was never far from her thoughts. He had been oddly quiet since the previous gala, his sharp remarks replaced with fleeting glances that seemed to carry more questions than answers. One evening, as Claire was organizing floral arrangements in the library, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to find Andrew standing in the doorway, his hands tucked into his pockets. "You've been busy," he said, his tone neutral. "Just doing my job, sir," Claire replied, keeping her gaze fixed on the flowers. Andrew stepped closer, his eyes scanning the room. "You have an eye for detail. Most people would have overlooked that vase by the window. It's always been slightly off-center." Claire glanced at him, surprised by the observation. "I suppose I notice small things," she said carefully. Andrew studied her for a moment before nodding. "Good. I expect everything to be flawless next weekend." "Yes, sir," Claire said, her voice steady, despite the unease creeping up her spine. As Andrew left the room, Claire exhaled slowly, her mind racing. There was something different about him lately, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. It was as if he were watching her, waiting for something. The next day, Claire found herself assigned to oversee the catering arrangements. The kitchen staff bustled around her, their movements a blur of efficiency as they prepared sample menus for Andrew's approval. "Bennett," Andrew's voice called from the doorway. Claire turned quickly, nearly dropping the clipboard in her hands. "Yes, sir. I need you to accompany me to the tasting," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Claire followed him into the tasting room, where a long table was set with meticulously plated dishes. Andrew gestured for her to sit, his expression unreadable. "Tell me what you think," he said, motioning toward the plates. Claire hesitated, unsure of what he wanted. "Sir, I don't think my opinion—" "Just try it," Andrew interrupted, his patience clearly thinning. Claire picked up a fork and sampled one of the dishes. The flavors were rich and complex, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this was some kind of test. "It's good," she said simply, setting the fork down. Andrew leaned back in his chair, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "Good isn't enough. Be specific." Claire frowned, caught off guard by his insistence. "The seasoning is balanced, but the texture could use more contrast. The sauce is a little heavy." Andrew's lips twitched into a faint smile. Interesting. For a brief moment, there was silence between them, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Then, without another word, Andrew stood and left the room, leaving Claire to wonder what game he was playing. As the week drew to a close, the preparations for the gala were nearly complete, but Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something was building, an undercurrent of tension she couldn't quite name, and through it all, Andrew Carter's watchful eyes never strayed far. The night of the anniversary gala arrived with a flurry of activity. The Carter estate was a masterpiece of grandeur, its expansive grounds illuminated by golden lights that danced in the crisp evening air. Guests began arriving in sleek black cars, stepping out in designer gowns and tailored suits. Every detail of the evening had been meticulously planned, and Claire, as one of the key staff members behind the scenes, felt the weight of the responsibility. She stood in the servant quarters, staring at herself in the mirror. The dress she wore wasn't one of her plain uniforms. It was the same elegant gown she had worn to the previous gala, a dress that had belonged to her late mother. Adjusting the hem and smoothing out imaginary wrinkles, Claire took a deep breath, steadying herself. "You can do this," she murmured under her breath. The head housekeeper's voice called her name sharply from the hall. "Claire, Mr. Carter is waiting. Get upstairs now." Hurrying out of the room, Claire made her way to the grand entrance where Andrew stood. He looked as poised and untouchable as ever, his black tuxedo tailored to perfection. His piercing gaze swept over her, pausing briefly before he nodded. "Stay close tonight," he instructed. "You'll be assisting me directly." "Yes, sir," Claire replied, keeping her voice neutral as they stepped into the ballroom. The grandeur of the event unfolded before them. The space was filled with the glittering elite, their conversations punctuated by bursts of laughter and the clinking of glasses. The chandeliers cast a soft glow over the room, creating an atmosphere of opulence and excess. Claire followed Andrew as he moved through the crowd, greeting guests and exchanging pleasantries with practiced ease. For the most part, she remained silent, holding a notepad and pen to jot down any instructions he might give. But as the night wore on, Claire couldn't help but notice the glances she was attracting. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but as she passed groups of guests, she caught snippets of hushed conversations. "She looks just like her," one woman whispered, her voice laced with intrigue. "Do you think it's possible?" another asked, her tone skeptical. Claire's heart raced as the murmurs grew louder. She glanced at Andrew, who seemed unbothered, his focus entirely on his guests. It wasn't until they stopped near a group of family acquaintances that Andrew's demeanor shifted. A man in his 60s, with graying hair and a sharp suit, narrowed his eyes as he looked at Claire. "Andrew?" the man said, his voice carrying an edge of disbelief. "Who is this young lady?" Andrew glanced at Claire briefly before answering. "Claire Bennett. She's one of the staff here at the estate." The man's expression darkened. "She's more than that, isn't she?" Claire felt a chill run down her spine. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. "What are you implying, James?" Andrew asked, his tone suddenly guarded. James took a step closer, his eyes never leaving Claire. "She looks just like Elizabeth. You can't tell me you don't see it." At the mention of the name, Claire's breath caught. Elizabeth. It wasn't a name she recognized, but the weight it carried was unmistakable. Andrew's jaw tightened, his gaze flickering to Claire before returning to James. "Elizabeth has been gone for years. Don't start with your conspiracies." "It's not a conspiracy," James insisted. "Look at her, Andrew. The resemblance is uncanny." By now, others had begun to notice the exchange. The murmurs in the room grew louder, guests craning their necks to get a better look at Claire. Feeling overwhelmed, Claire took a step back. "I don't know what this is about, but..." "Enough," Andrew said sharply, cutting her off. He turned to James, his eyes cold. "This isn't the time or place for this conversation." James raised his hands in mock surrender. "Fine, but you can't ignore the truth forever." The tension was palpable as Andrew led Claire away from the crowd, his grip on her arm firm but not harsh. Once they were out of earshot, he stopped abruptly and turned to face her. "What do you know about your family?" he demanded, his tone low but intense. Claire blinked, startled by the question. "Not much," she admitted. "I grew up in an orphanage. My mother, she died when I was very young. I don't even know my father's name." Andrew's eyes narrowed as he studied her, as if searching for something hidden beneath the surface. "And the dress, where did you get it?" Claire hesitated before answering. "It belonged to my mother. It's the only thing I have left of her." For a moment, Andrew said nothing, his expression unreadable. Then he took a step back, running a hand through his hair. "This can't be a coincidence," he muttered to himself. "What are you talking about?" Claire asked, her voice laced with frustration. Andrew looked at her, his piercing gaze filled with something Claire couldn't quite decipher. Fear, regret, or perhaps both. "Elizabeth Carter was my sister. She disappeared years ago, but before she did, she told me she was pregnant." The words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. Claire felt her knees weaken, her mind racing to make sense of what she had just heard. "Are you saying—" she began, but the words trailed off as the weight of the implication sank in. Andrew didn't respond, but the look in his eyes said everything. The silence that stretched between Andrew and Claire felt suffocating. Her mind churned with questions she couldn't yet form into words. Elizabeth Carter, pregnant, disappeared. How could any of this connect to her? "I need answers," Claire finally said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Why do you think I have anything to do with your sister?" Andrew regarded her, his expression guarded yet contemplative. For once, his usual arrogance seemed tempered by something more human. A flicker of doubt, perhaps even vulnerability. "Let's not jump to conclusions," Andrew said, his tone clipped. "But there are coincidences here that can't be ignored. Your resemblance to Elizabeth, the fact that you grew up in an orphanage, and now this dress. This dress was my mother's," Claire interrupted, gripping the fabric protectively. "It's all I have left of her. If you're suggesting it connects me to your family, then prove it." Andrew straightened, his usual commanding presence returning. "Fine, follow me." Claire hesitated, but eventually fell into step behind him, as he led her through the sprawling halls of the Carter estate. The grand surroundings, once intimidating, now felt suffocating as questions swirled in her mind. They arrived at a small, private study tucked away from the more public areas of the house. Andrew closed the door behind them and motioned for Claire to sit. "This room belonged to Elizabeth," he said, his voice quieter now. "After she disappeared, we kept it exactly as it was. My parents thought she might return someday." Claire glanced around, her eyes landing on a collection of framed photographs on a nearby shelf. One image in particular caught her attention. A young woman with striking features, her smile radiant as she stood in a garden. "That's her," Claire whispered, stepping closer. "Elizabeth." Andrew nodded. "My sister." Claire's heart raced as she studied the photo. The resemblance was undeniable, not just to herself, but also to the faint memories she had of her mother. "Why did she disappear?" Claire asked, turning to Andrew. He exhaled, leaning against the edge of the desk. "Elizabeth was always headstrong, willing to defy our parents' expectations. When she found out she was pregnant, she refused to reveal the father's identity. Our parents didn't approve. There were arguments, ugly ones. And then, one day, she was gone." Claire's chest tightened. "And you just let her leave?" Andrew's expression darkened. "You think I didn't try to find her? I searched for years, but it was like she vanished into thin air. The only thing I know is that she contacted me once, just before she disappeared, to tell me she was keeping the baby. She said she couldn't trust anyone else." The weight of his words hung in the air, Claire struggled to process the revelation. Could Elizabeth really be her mother? If so, what had happened to her? "There's something else," Andrew said, pulling her from her thoughts. Elizabeth mentioned something unique. She said her child would have a birthmark on their left arm, a crescent shape. Claire froze, her pulse quickening. Slowly, she lifted the sleeve of her dress, revealing the faint mark on her forearm, a small crescent moon that had always been there. Unnoticed by most, Andrew's eyes widened, his usual composure slipping for a moment. "It's true," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "You're her child." Claire stepped back, shaking her head. "No, this doesn't make sense. I don't know anything about this family. My mother died when I was little, and I've lived my whole life thinking I was just normal." "Normal?" Andrew said, his tone sharp. "Claire, if you're Elizabeth's daughter, you're a Carter. That means you have a claim to everything this family has built. I don't want any of it," Claire snapped, her voice breaking. "I just want to understand who I am." Andrew's expression softened, an unexpected shift that caught Claire off guard. "Then we'll find out. Together." The word startled her. This was the same man who had humiliated her, treated her as though she were invisible. Now he was offering to help her. "Why do you care?" she asked, narrowing her eyes. "This doesn't fit the version of you I've come to know." Andrew hesitated before answering. "Because I failed Elizabeth. If you really are her daughter, this is my chance to make things right." The sincerity in his voice took Claire by surprise. For the first time, she saw a crack in the armor of the arrogant billionaire. "Where do we start?" Claire asked cautiously, still wary of his motives. Andrew crossed the room to a locked drawer, retrieving a small box. Inside was a faded letter, the paper worn with age. "This was the last thing Elizabeth sent me," he said, handing it to Claire. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the letter. The handwriting was elegant but rushed, as though Elizabeth had written it in a hurry. "Andrew, I can't stay here. It's not safe. They don't want me to keep the baby. I need to protect her no matter what. Please understand. If anything happens to me, make sure she knows the truth. She'll always be part of this family." The letter ended abruptly, leaving Claire with more questions than answers. What did she mean by, "It's not safe"? Claire asked, looking up at Andrew. "I don't know," he admitted, his expression grim. "But I intend to find out." The hours after Claire read Elizabeth's letter passed in a blur. Questions buzzed in her mind, each one louder than the last. She had spent her entire life not knowing where she came from. And now, in a matter of hours, her world had been upended. Could Elizabeth truly be her mother? She stood in her small room in the servant quarters, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her sleeve was pushed up, revealing the crescent-shaped birthmark on her arm. It had always been there, a quiet part of her she never thought much about. Now, it felt like a piece of a puzzle she hadn't even known existed. A knock on her door broke her train of thought. Before she could respond, the door opened slightly, and Andrew stepped inside. "Do you always barge into people's rooms?" Claire asked, folding her arms. Andrew ignored her tone, his gaze landing on her exposed birthmark. His expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Confirmation, perhaps, or even guilt. "We need to talk," he said simply. Claire sighed, motioning for him to continue. "Fine, let's talk. What now?" Andrew closed the door behind him and leaned against the wall, his usual air of confidence tinged with hesitation. "This isn't just about you or Elizabeth. It's about the Carter family, and the lengths some of them would go to protect their power." Claire raised an eyebrow. "You're being vague, as usual." Andrew's jaw tightened. "Because I don't have all the answers yet, but I do know this. Elizabeth didn't leave by choice. She was forced out." "By who?" Claire demanded. Andrew hesitated. "That's what I'm trying to figure out. My parents had their expectations, especially when it came to the family's image. Elizabeth defied them by refusing to marry someone they approved of. And when she got pregnant, they saw her as a threat," Claire finished, the pieces clicking into place. Andrew nodded. "Exactly. And now, if you really are her daughter, you're a threat too. There are people in this family who won't want you here, Claire. You need to be careful." Claire laughed bitterly. "Careful, Andrew. I've been invisible my whole life. No one even noticed me until you dragged me into that gala." Andrew stepped closer, his tone firm. "You're not invisible anymore. They'll notice you now, and that makes you a target." Claire's stomach churned at his words. She had always prided herself on her ability to stay out of the spotlight, to avoid drawing attention. Now it seemed that anonymity was slipping away. "What do you suggest I do?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Andrew considered her for a moment before answering. "Stay close to me. I'll protect you." Claire couldn't help but scoff. "You? Protect me? That's rich. Coming from the man who humiliated me in front of half the city last week." Andrew's expression darkened. "I made a mistake. I see that now. But this is bigger than us, Claire. If you want answers, we have to work together." The sincerity in his voice caught Claire off guard. She studied him for a moment, trying to decipher his true intentions. For all his arrogance and flaws, there was something about Andrew that felt genuine, at least for now. "Fine," she said finally. "But if I find out you're playing me again, I'm done." "Fair enough," Andrew replied, a hint of a smirk playing on his lips. The next morning, Andrew and Claire returned to the study. Andrew had spent the night combing through old family records, searching for anything that might shed light on Elizabeth's disappearance. "I found something," he said, gesturing to a stack of papers on the desk. "Letters, meeting notes, even old invitations. Most of it is meaningless, but there's one thing that stood out." Claire leaned over the desk, her eyes scanning the document he pointed to. It was an old ledger, listing financial transactions made by the Carter family decades ago. One entry, dated shortly after Elizabeth's disappearance, caught her attention. "What's this?" she asked, pointing to the entry. "A large sum of money transferred to a private investigator," Andrew explained. "The timing is too convenient to be a coincidence. Someone was paying to track Elizabeth." Claire frowned. "But why would they do that if they wanted her gone?" Andrew shook his head. "That's what we need to figure out. Whoever this investigator was, they might have answers." Claire stared at the ledger, her mind racing. "Do you think they're still alive?" "There's only one way to find out," Andrew said, already reaching for his phone. Over the next few hours, Andrew made a series of calls, using his extensive network to track down any leads on the investigator. By late afternoon, he had a name and an address: James Howell, a retired private investigator now living in a quiet suburb outside the city. "Let's go," Andrew said, grabbing his coat. Claire hesitated. "Now what if he doesn't want to talk?" Andrew smirked. "Everyone talks when you know how to ask." As they drove to Howell's address, Claire's nerves began to fray. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were stepping into something much larger than either of them had anticipated. When they arrived at the modest house, Andrew knocked on the door with the confidence of a man used to getting what he wanted. An older man with sharp eyes and a wary expression answered, his gaze flickering between Andrew and Claire. "What do you want?" Howell asked gruffly. Andrew didn't hesitate. "We're here to talk about Elizabeth Carter." Howell's expression hardened. For a moment, Claire thought he might slam the door in their faces, but instead, he stepped aside and gestured for them to enter. "You'd better come in," he said, his tone laced with unease. The interior of James Howell's home was modest, but well kept. The walls were lined with bookshelves, and the faint smell of coffee lingered in the air. As Claire and Andrew stepped inside, Howell gestured toward the worn-out couch in the living room. "Make yourselves comfortable," he muttered, though his tone suggested he wasn't thrilled to have them there. Andrew, ever composed, took a seat, while Claire hesitated before perching on the edge of the couch. Her nerves were on edge, and she could feel Howell's scrutinizing gaze darting between her and Andrew. "You've got 5 minutes," Howell said, settling into a chair across from them. "What's this about Elizabeth Carter?" Andrew leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "You worked for my family decades ago, shortly after my sister Elizabeth disappeared. There was a substantial payment made to you. I want to know why." Howell's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. "That's a long time ago. I don't see how it's any of your business now." "It's my business," Andrew replied coolly, "because I believe Elizabeth's disappearance wasn't voluntary, and because this is her daughter." He gestured toward Claire, whose breath caught at the mention of her connection to Elizabeth. Howell's gaze shifted to Claire, his sharp eyes studying her intently. For a moment, his hardened demeanor seemed to crack. "Her daughter," he repeated, his voice softening. Claire nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I don't know much about my past," she admitted, "but everything points to Elizabeth being my mother. If you know anything, please, I need to know." Howell let out a long sigh, leaning back in his chair. "I remember the case," he said finally. "Your grandfather, that is, hired me to track Elizabeth down after she left. He claimed it was out of concern, but I didn't buy it. There was something off about the whole thing." "What do you mean by off?" Andrew pressed. Howell rubbed his temples, as if the memories weighed heavily on him. "Your family was powerful, Carter. Still is. But back then, they controlled everything. Money, influence, the press. When Elizabeth disappeared, I thought they wanted her found to bring her home. But as I dug deeper, I realized they weren't looking to reunite with her. They wanted her silenced." Claire's heart sank. "Silenced? Why?" Howell hesitated, his gaze flickering to Andrew. "She knew too much about the family, about the business, and when she got pregnant, that made her a liability. Your parents didn't want a scandal, and they sure as hell didn't want her raising a child who could challenge the family's legacy." Andrew's expression darkened, his hands clenching into fists. "So they hired you to find her, did you?" Howell nodded grimly. "I did. Took me months, but I tracked her to a small town upstate. She was living under a fake name, keeping a low profile. She didn't want to be found, and I could see why. She was terrified." "What happened?" Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I reported back to your grandfather," Howell said, his voice heavy with regret. "Told him where she was. I thought that was the end of it. But a few weeks later, I heard rumors. People saying she was dead, that she'd been caught in a house fire. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Fires happen. But now, you think it wasn't an accident?" Andrew finished, his tone cold. Howell nodded. "I think your family had something to do with it. Maybe not directly, but they wanted her out of the picture. And as far as I know, they succeeded." The room fell silent, the weight of Howell's words pressing down on them. Claire felt a knot of anger and sadness forming in her chest. She had spent her life longing for answers, and now that she was finally getting them, the truth was more devastating than she had imagined. "Do you have any proof?" Andrew asked, his voice sharp. Howell shook his head. "Nothing concrete, just my gut and a few old notes. But if you want to dig deeper, start with the Carter family archives. Your father kept detailed records of everything: financial transactions, correspondence, even some less than legal dealings. If there's evidence, it's there." Andrew stood, his jaw tight. "Where can I find these archives?" Howell hesitated, then sighed. "There's a private storage facility downtown. Your father used it for years, but be warned, Carter. If your family wanted this buried, they'll have gone to great lengths to make sure it stays that way." Andrew nodded, his expression resolute. "We'll handle it." As they made their way back to the car, Claire couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions: anger at the Carter family's actions, grief for the mother she never knew, and a growing determination to uncover the full truth. "Are you okay?" Andrew asked as they climbed into the car. Claire turned to him, her eyes burning with resolve. "No, but I will be once we expose everything they've done." Andrew gave her a small nod, his respect for her growing. "Then let's get to work." The drive back to the Carter estate was quiet, the tension between Claire and Andrew palpable. The revelations from Howell hung heavy in the air, and neither of them seemed ready to break the silence. Claire stared out the window, the city lights flickering like stars against the darkening sky. For the first time in her life, she felt like she was on the brink of understanding her past. Yet, the answers she'd received only deepened her confusion and pain. Her mother, Elizabeth, had lived in fear, hunted by the very family she belonged to. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Andrew finally asked, breaking the quiet. Claire turned to him, her expression hard. "Do I have a choice?" Andrew hesitated, then nodded. Fair point. When they arrived at the estate, the sprawling mansion felt more imposing than ever. The ornate architecture, once a symbol of wealth and power, now seemed to Claire like a monument to secrecy and betrayal. Andrew led her to his private office, a room she had rarely entered. The The walls were lined with bookshelves and framed certificates, a testament to his achievements and the Carter legacy. "Wait here," he said, stepping out briefly. Claire wandered around the room, her fingers brushing against the spines of books and the edges of trophies. Everything about the Carters seemed meticulously curated, a facade of perfection that hid the rot beneath. Andrew returned moments later with a small key in his hand. "This opens the storage facility," he said, placing it on the desk. "I'll go there first thing tomorrow." "I'm coming with you," Claire interjected, her tone firm. Andrew frowned. "It's risky. If someone in the family finds out—" "I don't care," Claire interrupted, her voice rising. "This is about my mother. I deserve to know the truth." Andrew studied her for a moment, then sighed. "Fine, but if things get dangerous, you do exactly as I say." The next morning, they set out early, the sun barely peeking over the horizon as they drove into the heart of the city. The storage facility was unassuming, its plain exterior belying the secrets it held. Inside, rows of metal doors stretched endlessly down narrow corridors. Andrew led Claire to one near the back, the number etched on the door matching the key in his hand. With a turn of the lock, the door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room packed with boxes and filing cabinets. Dust hung in the air, and the faint smell of mildew lingered. "This is it," Andrew said, stepping inside. Claire followed, her eyes scanning the room. She felt a strange mix of anticipation and dread as she took in the sheer volume of documents surrounding them. They began sorting through the boxes, each one filled with files, ledgers, and photographs. It was overwhelming, but Claire's determination kept her focused. "Look at this," Andrew said, holding up a faded photograph. Claire leaned over to examine it. The image showed a young Elizabeth, her arms wrapped protectively around a small bundle. "A baby. That's me," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. Andrew nodded. "It has to be." The photograph stirred something deep within Claire, a longing for the mother she never knew, mixed with anger at the family that had torn them apart. As they continued searching, Andrew pulled out a thick folder marked confidential. Inside were letters and financial records, many of them linked to the private investigator Howell had mentioned. "This is it," Andrew said, flipping through the pages. These payments matched the timeline of Elizabeth's disappearance. Claire's eyes scanned the letters, her stomach churning as she read the cold, calculated language. The documents detailed efforts to monitor Elizabeth, track her movements, and eventually, resolve the issue. "Resolve the issue," Claire said, her voice rising. "They're talking about her like she was a problem to be solved." Andrew's jaw tightened. "It gets worse." He handed her another page, a memo signed by their grandfather. The words on the page sent a chill down Claire's spine. "Ensure there are no loose ends." Claire's hands shook as she held the paper. "They killed her," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They murdered her to protect their legacy." Andrew placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression somber. "We don't know that for sure." Claire pulled away, her eyes blazing. "Don't we? Look at this, Andrew. Your family treated her like a threat, like she was disposable. And now, they'll do the same to me if they find out who I am." Andrew didn't argue. He knew she was right. The Carters had always been ruthless, willing to do whatever it took to protect their power. "We need to get this out of here," he said, gesturing to the files. "If anyone finds out we've been here, they'll come after us," Claire finished, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. They worked quickly, packing the most incriminating documents into a bag. Claire's mind raced as she thought about what they had uncovered. Her mother's life had been stolen from her, and now it was up to Claire to make sure the truth came to light. As they left the storage facility, the weight of their discovery settled heavily on their shoulders. Claire glanced at Andrew, her resolve hardening. "I won't let them get away with this," she said firmly. Andrew nodded, his expression grim. "Neither will I." Back at the Carter estate, Claire and Andrew sat in his private office, the bag of incriminating documents placed squarely on the desk between them. The silence was heavy, the weight of their discovery pressing down on both of them. Claire broke the silence first, her voice steady but laced with anger. "We have everything we need to expose them, don't we?" Andrew leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. "We have enough to make them nervous, but bringing this to light isn't going to be simple. The Carters don't go down without a fight." Claire leaned forward, her determination unwavering. "Then we fight. They destroyed my mother's life, Andrew. They can't get away with this." Andrew regarded her for a moment, the fiery resolve in her eyes a stark contrast to the quiet, reserved woman she had been just weeks ago. He nodded slowly. "You're right, but if we're going to do this, we need a plan." As they began sorting through the documents, Andrew explained the structure of the Carter family's power. Their grandfather, now deceased, had built an empire with strict control over every aspect of the business. While Andrew held significant influence, there were others, uncles, cousins, board members, who still wielded considerable power. "Some of them will try to silence this," Andrew said grimly. "If they think you're a threat, they won't hesitate to act." Claire met his gaze. "Then we need to make sure they can't bury it. We have to go public." Andrew hesitated. "Going public means risking everything. Are you ready for that?" Claire's hands clenched into fists. "I've spent my whole life being invisible, Andrew. If this is my chance to make them pay for what they did to my mother, I'm taking it." That evening, Andrew arranged a meeting with key members of the Carter family. The timing was deliberate, late enough to catch them off guard, but not so late as to arouse suspicion. The family gathered in the estate's grand dining room, their polished appearances and calm demeanors masking years of underlying tension. Claire stood beside Andrew, her presence drawing curious and skeptical glances from those around the table. Andrew cleared his throat, commanding their attention. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," he began. One of his uncles, a gray-haired man named Victor, leaned back in his chair, a smirk tugging at his lips. "This must be important if it couldn't wait until morning. What's this about, Andrew?" Andrew's gaze swept the room before landing on Victor. "It's about Elizabeth." The smirk vanished, replaced by a wary frown. Around the table, the other Carters exchanged uneasy glances. "Elizabeth?" Another family member scoffed. "Why bring up something that's been buried for decades?" "Because it shouldn't have been buried," Andrew shot back, his tone cold. He reached into the bag beside him and pulled out a stack of documents, placing them on the table. "These are records of payments, letters, and memos, proof that Elizabeth was tracked, targeted and ultimately silenced by this family." The room erupted in murmurs, some defensive, others accusatory. Victor's voice rose above the commotion. "This is absurd. Whatever happened back then was handled appropriately. Dragging it up now is reckless." Claire stepped forward, her voice cutting through the noise. "It's not reckless, it's justice. Elizabeth was my mother, and this family took her from me." The room fell silent, all eyes turning to Claire. Victor's eyes narrowed. "And who are you supposed to be?" Andrew spoke before Claire could respond. "She's Elizabeth's daughter. The birthmark on her arm matches exactly what Elizabeth described before she disappeared." "The resemblance alone is undeniable." Victor's face darkened. "This is a dangerous game you're playing, Andrew. Do you have any idea what you're risking by bringing her here?" "I know exactly what I'm risking," Andrew replied, his voice firm. "But I also know what's right. This family destroyed Elizabeth's life, and now you're going to answer for it." Victor stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You think you can walk in here with some papers and accusations and tear this family apart? You're more naive than I thought." Claire stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling beneath the surface. "You can't intimidate me. I'm not going to let you cover this up." Victor's gaze shifted to her, his eyes cold and calculating. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into, girl." Andrew moved to stand beside Claire, his presence a silent show of support. "She's not alone, and if you try anything, you'll regret it." The room was charged with tension, the air heavy with unspoken threats. One by one, the other Carters began to murmur their dissent, unsure of where their loyalties lay. "This isn't over," Victor said finally, his voice low and dangerous. "You've opened a door you can't close. Andrew, I hope you're ready for the consequences." With that, he stormed out, leaving the room in uneasy silence. Claire turned to Andrew, her chest heaving with a mix of adrenaline and fear. "Do you think they'll try to stop us?" Andrew nodded grimly. "They'll try, but we won't let them." The tension lingered long after Victor's dramatic exit. The other members of the Carter family had dispersed, their murmurs and suspicious glances leaving an air of unease in the grand dining room. Claire and Andrew remained behind, the weight of the confrontation settling over them. "He's not going to back down," Claire said quietly, her arms crossed as she stared at the pile of documents on the table. Andrew nodded, his jaw clenched. "Victor's not just a figurehead. He's the one who kept the family's secrets after my father died. If anyone knows the full extent of what happened to Elizabeth, it's him." Claire turned to him, her expression firm. "Then we need more if we're going to take this public. We need something they can't refute. Something personal. Something that tells Elizabeth's story in her own words." Andrew considered her suggestion, his brows furrowing. There might be one thing. He stood abruptly and motioned for Claire to follow him. Intrigued, she trailed behind him through the estate's long, echoing hallways until they reached a locked door. "This was Elizabeth's private room," Andrew said, pulling a key from his pocket. "No one's been in here since she disappeared. My parents kept it sealed, and after they passed, I left it untouched." As the door creaked open, Claire stepped inside, her breath catching at the sight. The room was a snapshot of another time. A delicate vanity covered in faded perfume bottles, a bookshelf lined with worn novels, and a neatly made bed with a floral quilt. Dust covered every surface, but the room still carried an air of intimacy, as though Elizabeth had just stepped out and might return at any moment. "This was hers," Claire murmured, running her fingers over the edge of the vanity. Andrew nodded, his voice softer now. "She spent hours in here. It was the one place in the house where she felt like she could breathe." Claire's eyes scanned the room, landing on a small leather-bound book on the bookshelf. She reached for it, her fingers brushing the cover as she pulled it free. "What's that?" Andrew asked, stepping closer. Claire opened the book, her heart racing as she realized what it was. It's her diary. The two of them sat on the bed, the silence heavy as Claire flipped through the pages. The handwriting was elegant but rushed. The words filled with emotion that leapt off the paper. March 12th. One entry read, "They don't understand. They only care about appearances, about power. But this child is mine. She's the only thing that matters now." Claire's throat tightened as she read. The words felt like a bridge connecting her to the mother she had never known. "She was scared," Claire said, her voice trembling. "But she was determined. She wanted to protect me." Andrew leaned closer, his eyes scanning the pages. "Keep reading. There might be something in here that tells us more about what happened." Claire turned the pages carefully, her pulse quickening as she found another entry. April 5th. "I can't trust anyone anymore. Even Andrew is starting to ask questions. If they find out where I'm going, they'll never let me leave. But I have no choice for her sake. I have to disappear." Andrew's eyes widened at the mention of his name. "She didn't trust me." Claire hesitated before answering. "She must have been scared. Maybe she thought you'd tell your parents." Andrew frowned, guilt flashing across his face. "I never would have betrayed her. I didn't understand how bad things had gotten." They continued reading, piecing together Elizabeth's thoughts and fears. Each entry painted a clearer picture of a woman trapped by her family's expectations, desperate to carve out a life for herself and her child. Finally, they reached the last entry, dated just days before her disappearance. April 17th. "I've made arrangements. By this time tomorrow, I'll be gone. I've left instructions for Andrew in case anything happens to me. He's the only one I trust with this. If he finds this diary, Andrew, please protect her. She's all that matters now." Claire's hands shook as she closed the diary, tears welling in her eyes. "She trusted you, even when she was scared. She believed you'd do the right thing." Andrew swallowed hard, his expression a mix of regret and determination. "And I failed her, but I won't fail you." Claire looked at him, her emotions swirling. For the first time, she saw a different side of Andrew. Not the cold, calculating businessman, but a man burdened by the mistakes of his past and desperate to make amends. "What did she mean by instructions?" Claire asked. Andrew's brow furrowed. "I don't know. If she left something for me, I never found it." Claire glanced around the room, her gaze landing on the vanity. "She must have hidden it. Somewhere she knew you'd find it if you looked." They began searching the room, carefully examining every drawer and crevice. Finally, Claire's fingers brushed against something tucked beneath the lining of a drawer, a small envelope sealed with wax. "This must be it," she said, holding it up. Andrew took the envelope, breaking the seal with trembling hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly as he unfolded it. His eyes widened. "It's an address," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This must be where she planned to go." Claire leaned closer, her heart pounding. "Then that's where we need to go next." Andrew nodded, his expression resolute. "If this is where her story ended, then it's where ours begins." The envelope trembled slightly in Andrew's hands as he stared at the address scrawled in Elizabeth's handwriting. It was a rural location, far from the bustling cities the Carters had always inhabited. A quiet town called Willow Creek. "Willow Creek," Claire murmured, peering at the note. "Why there? What's so special about it?" Andrew shook his head, his brow furrowed in thought. "I don't know. But if Elizabeth planned to go there, it's the only lead we have. We leave tomorrow." The decision was made quickly. Claire spent the rest of the evening packing a small bag, her mind racing with possibilities. What if they found answers in Willow Creek? What if the truth was even darker than she feared? Andrew, meanwhile, prepared for the trip with his usual efficiency. Though his mind was far from calm, his sister's words haunted him. Protect her. She's all that matters now. He had failed Elizabeth once, but he was determined not to fail Claire. The next morning, they set out early, the city fading into the distance as they drove toward the countryside. The landscape shifted from towering skyscrapers to rolling hills and open fields, the pace of life seemingly slowing with every mile. Claire stared out the window, her thoughts as turbulent as the clouds gathering in the sky. She turned to Andrew, breaking the silence. "What do you think we'll find there?" Andrew kept his eyes on the road, his jaw tight. "I don't know, but whatever it is, we need to be ready." When they arrived in Willow Creek, the contrast to the city was stark. The town was small and quaint, with a single main street lined with shops and cafes. It felt untouched by time, a place where everyone likely knew each other's business. The address on the note led them to a modest house on the outskirts of town. The white picket fence was weathered, and the garden was overgrown, as though it hadn't been tended in years. "This is it," Andrew said, parking the car. Claire stepped out, her heart pounding as they approached the front door. The house felt oddly familiar, as though it held memories she couldn't quite grasp. Andrew knocked, his firm hand echoing through the quiet street. For a moment, there was no response, and Claire's chest tightened with anxiety. Finally, the door creaked open, revealing an elderly woman with kind eyes and a hesitant smile. She looked between Andrew and Claire, her gaze lingering on Claire's face. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, her voice soft but wary. Andrew stepped forward. "We're looking for information about Elizabeth Carter. She lived here, didn't she?" The woman's expression shifted, a flicker of recognition passing through her eyes. She stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Inside, the house was cozy but cluttered, with shelves filled with books and photographs. The woman motioned for them to sit in the small living room, her hands trembling slightly as she poured tea. "I knew Elizabeth," she said finally, her voice tinged with sadness. "She stayed here for a while, years ago. She was kind, but she was running from something." Claire leaned forward, her heart racing. "Did she ever say what it was?" The woman hesitated, her gaze dropping to her lap. "Not in so many words, but I could tell she was scared. She didn't trust anyone, and she always seemed to be looking over her shoulder." Andrew's jaw tightened. "Did she ever mention the Carters? Our family?" The woman nodded slowly. "She said they wouldn't stop until they found her. That's why she left. She didn't want them to find..." She trailed off, her eyes shifting to Claire, who... "Me," Claire finished, her voice trembling. "She didn't want them to find me." The woman nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "She loved you so much. She used to talk about you all the time, how she wanted you to grow up safe and happy. But one day she just... left. She said it wasn't safe here anymore." Claire's chest tightened. "Did she say where she was going?" The woman shook her head. "No, but she left some things behind. I kept them, hoping one day someone would come looking for her." She stood slowly, shuffling to a small chest in the corner of the room. She opened it carefully, pulling out a bundle of papers tied with a faded ribbon. "These belong to Elizabeth," the woman said, placing the bundle on the table. Claire reached for it, her hands trembling as she untied the ribbon. Inside were letters, photographs, and a small locket. She opened the locket to find a tiny photo of a baby, herself, and the initials EC engraved inside. "She never stopped loving you," the woman said gently. Claire's vision blurred with tears as she clutched the locket tightly. "Thank you," she whispered. Andrew, who had been silently observing, leaned forward. "Do you know who might have been after her? Anyone who came looking for her here?" The woman hesitated, her expression darkening. "There was a man. He came asking questions not long after she left. I didn't trust him. He had a cruel look in his eyes. I think he worked for your family." Andrew's fists clenched. "Victor." Claire turned to him, her voice trembling. "What do we do now?" Andrew's eyes were cold, his resolve firm. "We find him, and we make him tell us everything." The drive back from Willow Creek was heavy with unspoken tension. Claire clutched the locket tightly in her hand, her emotions a whirlwind of grief and determination. Each piece of information they had uncovered seemed to bring them closer to the truth. Yet the shadow of the Carter family loomed larger than ever. Andrew remained silent, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. His mind raced, piecing together the fragments of Elizabeth's story. Victor's involvement was becoming more evident, and the implications were darker than he had anticipated. "Victor knew where she was," Andrew said finally, his voice cutting through the quiet. "That man the woman mentioned. It had to be one of his people." Claire turned to him, her expression hard. "Then why didn't he act sooner? If he wanted to get rid of her, why wait?" Andrew frowned. Maybe he was waiting for the right moment. Or maybe she slipped away before he could do anything. Either way, he'll have answers. By the time they returned to the Carter estate, night had fallen. The mansion was quiet, but the tension inside was palpable. Claire and Andrew retreated to his office, spreading the contents of the bundle from Willow Creek across the desk. Among the letters and photographs, one note stood out. It was a hastily written message, addressed to no one in particular. "They're closing in. I don't have much time. If you find this, protect her, please." Claire stared at the note, her heart aching. "She knew," she murmured. "She knew they wouldn't stop." Andrew exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "And she was right. Victor won't stop now either. Not with everything we've uncovered." As if on cue, Andrew's phone buzzed on the desk. He picked it up, his brow furrowing as he read the screen. "It's Victor," he said, his tone grim. "He wants to meet." Claire's stomach tightened. "Do you think he knows what we're planning?" Andrew nodded slowly. "He's too smart not to. This isn't a coincidence. He's trying to get ahead of us." "Are you going to go?" Claire asked, her voice steady despite the fear creeping in. "I have to," Andrew said, "but I'm not going alone." The meeting was set for the next afternoon at a private club in the heart of the city. The exclusive location, with its mahogany-paneled walls and hushed atmosphere, was a familiar setting for high-stakes conversations among the elite. Andrew and Claire arrived together, their expressions carefully composed. Claire felt out of place in the opulent surroundings, but she drew strength from the determination that had carried her this far. Victor was already waiting in a private room, seated in a leather armchair with a glass of whiskey in hand. He looked up as they entered, a smirk playing on his lips. "Andrew," he said, his tone dripping with mock warmth. "And the girl. How lovely of you to join me." Andrew didn't respond to the greeting, his gaze cold as he took a seat across from Victor. Claire sat beside him, her spine straight, despite the weight of Victor's piercing stare. "Let's skip the pleasantries," Andrew said. "You know why we're here?" Victor chuckled, swirling his whiskey. "Oh, I know exactly why you're here. Stirring up old ghosts. Digging where you shouldn't be. Tell me, Andrew, what's your endgame? Do you really think you can take me down?" Andrew leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. "This isn't about taking you down, Victor. It's about justice. For Elizabeth. And for Claire." Victor's smirk faded, his expression hardening. "Justice. Don't be naive. This family doesn't operate on justice. It operates on power. Always has. Always will. Elizabeth knew that, and she made her choice. She was a liability, and liabilities get dealt with." Claire's hands clenched into fists, her anger boiling over. "She was your family. She wasn't a liability. She was a person. And you destroyed her life." Victor turned his gaze to her, his eyes cold. "You think you know the truth, little girl, but you're just a pawn in this game. You always were." Andrew stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Enough. You can keep trying to intimidate her, but it won't work. We have proof, documents, records, everything we need to expose what you did." Victor's expression darkened, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. "You think that's enough to stop me? Go ahead. Try. But remember this, Andrew. If you come for me, I'll come for you. And her." Claire felt a chill run down her spine, but she refused to let Victor see her fear. "You can try," she said, her voice steady, "but I'm not going to stop until everyone knows what you did." Victor stood, his imposing figure casting a shadow over the room. "You've made a mistake coming here," he said. "I'd watch my back if I were you." With that, he strode out, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. Andrew turned to Claire, his expression grim. "This just got a lot more dangerous." Claire met his gaze, her resolve unshaken. "Good. That means we're getting closer." The tension in the car ride back from the meeting with Victor was suffocating. Claire stared out the window, her mind replaying every word of the confrontation. Victor's threats still echoed in her ears, but they only fueled her determination. She had come too far to back down now. Andrew, on the other hand, gripped the steering wheel tightly, his jaw clenched. He had underestimated Victor's ruthlessness. The game had escalated, and he knew Victor wouldn't hesitate to make good on his threats. "We need to act fast," Andrew said, breaking the silence. "Victor knows we're coming for him. He'll try to destroy any evidence before we can use it." Claire turned to him, her expression resolute. "Then we don't give him the chance. We release what we have. Now." Andrew glanced at her, his brow furrowed. "It's not that simple. If we go public without solid proof, Victor will bury us. We need to make sure everything is airtight." "We have enough," Claire argued. "The documents from the storage unit, the diary, the letters, they paint a clear picture of what happened. We can't wait for a perfect moment, Andrew. Elizabeth didn't have that luxury, and neither do we." Andrew hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Claire was right. Waiting could cost them everything, but rushing could put them directly in Victor's crosshairs. "All right," he said finally. "We'll go public, but we'll do it strategically. We'll leak the story to someone who can't be silenced, someone with a platform big enough to make it impossible for Victor to cover it up." Claire nodded, relief washing over her. "Do you know anyone like that?" Andrew's lips curved into a faint smile. "I have a few ideas." The next day, Andrew and Claire met with a journalist named Rachel Porter, a hard-hitting investigative reporter known for taking down powerful figures. She was someone Andrew trusted, an ally who wasn't afraid to challenge the elite. Rachel listened intently as Andrew and Claire laid out their case, her sharp eyes scanning the documents they presented. When they finished, she leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "This is explosive," Rachel said finally. "If everything here checks out, it's going to shake the Carter family to its core. But you know what you're up against, right? Victor won't just roll over. He'll fight this tooth and nail. We're ready for that," Andrew said firmly. "We just need someone to help us make it public." Rachel nodded slowly. "All right, I'll run with it, but I'll need time to verify everything before I publish. Once this goes live, there's no turning back." "Do whatever you need to," Claire said, her voice steady. "Just make sure the truth gets out." As they left the meeting, Claire felt a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time, it felt like they were truly making progress. But the battle was far from over. That evening, as they returned to the Carter estate, the air was thick with anticipation. Andrew's phone buzzed constantly with updates from Rachel, each one confirming the validity of their evidence. The story was coming together, piece by piece. But as they stepped into the house, they were met with an unexpected sight. The grand entryway was filled with security guards, their presence a clear message. Victor wasn't taking any chances. "Looks like he's making his move," Claire muttered, her gaze narrowing. Andrew nodded grimly. "He's trying to intimidate us, don't let him." They made their way to Andrew's office, but before they could close the door, one of the guards stepped forward. "Mr. Carter," the guard said, his tone formal. "Mr. Victor has requested your presence in the dining room." Andrew exchanged a glance with Claire, his expression hardening. "Tell him I'll be there shortly." As the guard left, Claire turned to Andrew. "Do you think he knows about Rachel?" "Probably," Andrew said. "But he won't act until he's sure. He'll try to corner us first, make us doubt ourselves." Claire crossed her arms, her voice firm. "Then let's not give him the satisfaction." When they entered the dining room, Victor was seated at the head of the table, his expression smug. The tension in the room was palpable, the silence broken only by the faint clink of ice in Victor's glass. "Andrew," Victor said smoothly, gesturing for him to sit. "Claire, join me." Andrew remained standing, his arms crossed. "If you have something to say, say it." Victor chuckled, his gaze shifting to Claire. "Bold, isn't he, just like your mother?" Claire's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. Victor leaned back in his chair, his smirk fading. "You've made a mistake, Andrew. Both of you. You think you can take me down with a few old documents and some sob story about Elizabeth. This family was built on power, and power doesn't crumble so easily. We're not here to play your games." "Victor," Andrew said coldly, "the truth is coming out, whether you like it or not." Victor's eyes narrowed, his voice dropping to a dangerous tone. "You're playing with fire, Andrew. You're dragging this family's name through the mud, and for what? To avenge someone who's been gone for decades." "It's not about vengeance," Claire said, her voice steady. "It's about justice, and you can't stop it." Victor stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "We'll see about that." As he stormed out of the room, Andrew turned to Claire, his expression grim. "It's starting. He's going to push back, hard." Claire met his gaze, her resolve unshaken. "Then we'll push harder." Victor's ominous departure hung over the Carter estate like a storm cloud. Claire and Andrew knew the clock was ticking. The documents had been handed off to Rachel, and soon the world would know the truth about Elizabeth's disappearance and the family's dark secrets. But Victor's threats were not idle. Claire sat in Andrew's office, her hands tightly clasped as she stared at the pile of evidence they had collected. "Do you think he'll try to stop the story before it breaks?" Andrew nodded grimly. "If he can. Victor has connections everywhere. Media, law enforcement, even politics. But Rachel's careful. She'll release the story all at once. To every major outlet, he won't be able to contain it." "Good," Claire said, her voice hard. "He shouldn't have the chance to bury it, like he did with her." Andrew placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch surprisingly steady. "We're almost there, Claire, but we have to be ready for whatever comes next." The next morning, the Carter estate was unusually quiet. The tension in the air was palpable, and the presence of Victor's security guards only added to the unease. Andrew spent hours on the phone, coordinating with Rachel and his legal team, while Claire prepared herself mentally for the storm they were about to unleash. By midday, the first headline broke. "Carter family scandal. New evidence points to foul play in Elizabeth Carter's disappearance." It was followed by another. "Secrets of the Carter dynasty. A daughter's quest for justice." Within hours, the story was everywhere. News outlets dissected the documents, speculated on the implications, and debated the Carter family's future. Photographs of Elizabeth, Claire, and the incriminating records were splashed across screens and newspapers, and the public response was immediate. Claire watched the coverage from Andrew's office, her emotions a mix of triumph and apprehension. The world finally knew the truth, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Victor was already plotting his next move. "Rachel did it," Andrew said, walking into the room with a satisfied expression. "The story's everywhere. Victor can't suppress it now." Claire nodded, her gaze fixed on the screen. "But he won't go quietly. You know that, right?" Andrew's smile faded. "I know, which is why we need to be prepared." Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the tension in the estate reached its breaking point. A knock on the door interrupted the uneasy calm, and a guard entered the room. "Mr. Carter," he said, his tone clipped. "Victor is here. He's demanding to see you." Andrew exchanged a glance with Claire, his expression darkening. "Send him to the library." Claire followed Andrew as they made their way to the Grand Library, the ornate room now a battleground for the family's power struggle. Victor stood by the fireplace, his expression cold and calculating. "Enjoying your moment in the spotlight," Victor said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You've made quite the spectacle of yourself. And this family. Andrew crossed his arms, his gaze unwavering. The truth needed to come out. You can't intimidate us anymore. Victor. Victor's eyes flicked to Claire, his lips curling into a sneer. And you, little girl, do you really think this changes anything? Do you think the world cares about your sob story? Claire stepped forward, her chin held high. It's not about me. It's about her. Elizabeth deserved better. And so do I. Victor's smirk faded, replaced by a glimmer of frustration. You think you've won? This family was built on power, on control. You've thrown a wrench into the machine, but it won't stop. You'll see. Andrew's voice was sharp. You're done, Victor. The world knows what you did. You can try to spin it. But the evidence speaks for itself. Victor took a step closer, his voice lowering to a dangerous tone. You think evidence is enough? This family doesn't survive by following the rules. You've crossed a line, Andrew, and there's no coming back. Claire felt a chill run down her spine, but she stood her ground. You're right. There's no going back. That's why we're moving forward. Without you. Victor's eyes narrowed, his fists clenching at his sides. You have no idea what you've unleashed. But don't worry. You'll find out soon enough. With that, he turned and stormed out of the room, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Claire exhaled slowly, her shoulders tense. Do you think he'll try something? Andrew nodded, his expression grim. He's desperate, and desperate men are dangerous. As the night wore on, the fallout from the story continued to ripple through the media. Allies of the Carter family began to distance themselves, and questions about the family's future dominated the news cycle. In the quiet of the estate, Claire and Andrew sat together, their exhaustion evident. Do you regret it? Claire asked softly. Andrew shook his head. No. For the first time in years, I feel like I'm doing something right. Claire managed a small smile. Me too, but it's not over, is it? Andrew met her gaze, his voice steady. Not yet, but we're closer than ever. The morning after the story broke, the Carter estate was a shadow of its former self. What once symbolized unshakable power now seemed fragile under the weight of scandal. The media frenzy had reached its peak, with reporters camped outside the gates, eager for a glimpse of the family in turmoil. Claire watched the chaos from a second-story window, her heart heavy with a mixture of triumph and dread. The world finally knew the truth about Elizabeth, but the cost of exposing it was becoming increasingly clear. Andrew entered the room, his phone pressed to his ear. His expression was tense, his voice low as he spoke to someone on the other end. No, we're not issuing a statement yet. Let them speculate. The more noise they make, the harder it'll be for Victor to spin this. He ended the call and turned to Claire, his shoulders sagging slightly. Rachel just sent me another update. Victor's trying to discredit the story, but it's not working. Too many people are backing it up now. Claire nodded, her gaze still fixed on the reporters outside. Good. Let him scramble. He deserves it. Andrew stepped closer, his tone softening. You did it, Claire. You honored Elizabeth. She'd be proud of you. Claire looked at him, her eyes glistening. We did it. And we're not done yet. Before Andrew could respond, there was a knock at the door. A guard entered, his expression urgent. Mr. Carter, there's been a breach in the estate's security system. We believe it's Victor. Andrew's jaw tightened, his entire demeanor shifting. Where is he now? We believe he's headed to the library, the guard replied. Claire's heart raced as she exchanged a glance with Andrew. Without a word, they both hurried down the hall, their footsteps echoing against the marble floors. When they reached the library, the door was ajar, and the sound of papers rustling filled the air. Andrew pushed the door open, revealing Victor standing by the desk, rifling through the documents they had gathered. Looking for something? Andrew asked, his voice cold. Victor turned, his expression dark. You've gone too far, Andrew. This little stunt of yours is tearing the family apart. Andrew stepped into the room, his presence commanding. The family tore itself apart when it turned on Elizabeth. You don't get to play the victim now. Victor slammed a fist on the desk, his frustration boiling over. You don't understand. Everything I did was to protect this family. Elizabeth was a threat. And now you've made her daughter one too. Claire stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. You didn't protect anyone, Victor. You destroyed lives to hold on to power, but it's over now. Victor's gaze shifted to her, his eyes narrowing. You think you've won because you exposed some dirty secrets. You have no idea what you're up against. This family doesn't survive by playing fair. Andrew moved to stand beside Claire, his expression unyielding. That's where you're wrong. This family doesn't survive without accountability. And for the first time, it's going to face it. Victor sneered, his fists clenching. You think you're some kind of hero? You've made enemies, Andrew. You've put a target on her back and yours. Andrew's voice was calm but firm. If you're threatening us, you'd better make good on it, because as of today, you're done. The board will remove you. The media will destroy you, and the law will take care of the rest. Victor's smirk faltered, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. You think you can just cut me out? I built this family's empire. I'm the only reason it still stands. And now you're the reason it's falling apart, Claire said, her voice sharp. For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of their words hanging in the air. Then Victor stepped back, his expression hardening. You'll regret this, he said quietly. Both of you. With that, he stormed out of the room, leaving the door swinging on its hinges. Claire exhaled shakily, her adrenaline beginning to fade. Do you think he'll try something else? Andrew nodded grimly. Victor doesn't know how to lose. He'll keep fighting until he's got nothing left. Then we need to make sure he has nothing left, Claire said, her voice firm. Andrew placed a hand on her shoulder, a flicker of pride in his eyes. We will, together. By the end of the day, the fallout from the story had escalated. Victor's name was plastered across every major news outlet, and his influence within the Carter family was rapidly crumbling. The board of directors called an emergency meeting, and Andrew was prepared to present the evidence that would ensure Victor's removal. But as the meeting began, it became clear that Victor wasn't going down without a fight. He stormed into the boardroom with a stack of counterclaims, accusing Andrew of fabricating the evidence and dragging the family's name through the mud for personal gain. The board members, torn between loyalty and self-preservation, hesitated. The room buzzed with tension as Andrew stood to address them. This isn't about loyalty or appearances, he said, his voice steady. It's about doing what's right. Elizabeth was betrayed by this family, and Victor has been covering it up for years. If you turn a blind eye now, you're just as guilty as he is. Claire, seated in the back of the room, watched as Andrew's words resonated with the board. One by one, the members began to speak up, their voices growing louder in support of accountability. When the vote was cast, the decision was unanimous. Victor was removed from his position, and an investigation into his actions was launched immediately. As the board adjourned, Claire and Andrew exchanged a look of relief. For the first time, it felt like justice was within reach. We did it, Claire said quietly. Andrew nodded, a small smile breaking through his usual stoicism. We did, but there's still more to do. The morning after Victor's removal, the Carter estate was unusually calm. The media frenzy outside the gates had begun to dwindle as the story shifted focus to Victor's downfall and the sweeping changes within the family. Inside, the weight that had hung over Claire and Andrew for weeks began to lift, replaced by a tentative sense of hope. Claire stood in the garden, the cool morning air brushing against her skin. She held the locket tightly in her hand, her gaze fixed on the horizon. For the first time, she felt like she could breathe. Andrew approached quietly, his steps crunching against the gravel path. You've been out here for a while, he said, his voice softer than usual. Claire turned to him, a small smile playing on her lips. Just needed some air. It's a lot to process. Andrew nodded, his expression thoughtful. It's over now. Victor's gone, and the board is backing the reforms. The family's legacy will survive, but it'll be different. Better, Claire raised an eyebrow. You really think this family can change? Andrew hesitated, then sighed. I think it has to, and that starts with us. Claire studied him for a moment. The man who had once seemed so cold and distant now standing before her with a genuine sense of humility. You've changed, she said quietly. Andrew looked at her, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Maybe I had to. They stood in silence for a moment, the sounds of the estate fading into the background. I found something in Elizabeth's things last night, Andrew said, breaking the quiet. He pulled a small folded letter from his pocket and handed it to Claire. Claire unfolded the letter, her hands trembling as she read the familiar handwriting. My dearest Claire, if you're reading this, it means you've found your way back to where you belong. I'm so sorry for everything I couldn't give you, for the life I couldn't share with you. But please know that every choice I made was for you, to keep you safe, to give you a chance at a better future. You are my greatest joy, my brightest star. Never forget that. Tears streamed down Claire's face as she read the letter, her heart aching with a mixture of love and loss. She never stopped fighting for you, Andrew said, his voice steady. Even when the odds were against her. Claire clutched the letter to her chest, her resolve strengthening. Then I'll keep fighting for her, for the life she wanted me to have. Andrew placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. You already have. She'd be proud of you. The days that followed were a whirlwind of change. Victor's departure from the family's leadership sent shockwaves through the business world, and Andrew worked tirelessly to stabilize the company while implementing reforms to ensure transparency and accountability. Claire, meanwhile, found herself stepping into a new role, not as an outsider, but as someone with a rightful place in the Carter legacy. Though she had no desire to immerse herself in the family's business, she used her newfound position to advocate for causes close to her heart, ensuring Elizabeth's memory was honored in every decision she made. One evening, as the sun set over the estate, Andrew found Claire in the library, sorting through the remnants of Elizabeth's life. What are you working on now? He asked, leaning against the doorway. Claire held up a framed photograph of Elizabeth. I'm thinking about starting a foundation in her name, something that helps women and children in difficult situations. People like her, who felt like they didn't have a way out. Andrew smiled, a genuine warmth in his expression. She'd love that. Claire nodded, her gaze softening as she looked at the photograph. It's the least I can do. She gave everything for me. It's time I start giving back. Andrew stepped into the room, his tone lighter. Well, if you need funding, I know a guy. Claire laughed, the sound breaking through the weight of the past few weeks. I'll keep that in mind. As the estate began to settle into its new rhythm, Claire and Andrew stood side by side, looking out over the grounds. The garden, once a place of solitude and reflection, now felt like a symbol of growth and renewal. Do you ever think about what's next? Claire asked, her voice quiet. Andrew nodded, his gaze distant. All the time, for the first time, I feel like there's a chance to do things differently. To be better, Claire smiled, a sense of peace washing over her. Then let's make the most of it. Andrew turned to her, his expression serious but hopeful. Together, Claire said firmly. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the estate in a warm golden glow, Claire felt a sense of closure she hadn't thought possible. Elizabeth's story had been told, her sacrifices honored, and the truth finally brought to light. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was a beginning, a chance to rebuild, to heal, and to create a legacy built on justice, love, and hope.